Y'all can sit down, and so will I. I landed on my knee. It hurts, but I'll live. I'm taking a little informal poll here. How many of you all really, really loved school when you were kids? Some of us. I loved school. In reflecting on my childhood, I sometimes try to figure out why. And true confession, I am pretty sure part of it was that I was just the quintessential keener. And I crave approval, and I discovered that school was a place where I could get it. I loved getting A's. And part of that was because I came home with a C in algebra once, not my strong suit, to put it mildly, and got a very uncomfortable lecture from my father on how a C was average and average wasn't good enough. I didn't even like getting B's. I felt good about myself when I got A's. Maths, however, were a constant problem, still are. I don't math. Leaving completely aside that this was a totally artificial and probably unhealthy way to boost my own ego and self-esteem, the other thing I loved about school was that I absolutely loved learning new things. And every night I would look back on my day and reflect on what new thing I'd learned that day, and if I couldn't think of one, well, then I'd get out a book and my flashlight and read under the covers until I learned something interesting. And I still do that. Only now I don't have to juggle a book and a flashlight under the covers because I have a cell phone where I can look up the entirety of humanity's accumulated knowledge, and there's no one to tell me, put that darn flashlight away and go to sleep. Now, sometimes at night I just look at pictures of cats and fight with strangers on the internet, but more often at night I use my cell phone to slake my thirst for knowledge. Frequently esoteric and useless knowledge, but you never know when it's going to come in handy. And one of the things I love about being a minister is that often it's actually part of my job description to learn new things. I absolutely love that. And as an aside, one of the things I always say that I love about being a minister is that the job is never the same 2 days in a row. Incidentally, that's also one of the things I hate about being a minister, but I digress. Anyhow, in the course of writing sermons on a fairly regular basis, I'm so often blessed by learning new things. Even with biblical stories that I've heard a gazillion times, there's always new insights to be found, and I love that too. This is the perfect job for me. So in the course of studying to write this sermon, I learned some new things, and I want to share them with you. Now, I heard the story of Rahab when I was a little kid in Sunday school in the First Baptist Church of Mill Valley, and what I recall most about that is that we built little houses for Rahab out of shoeboxes and had little cutout Hebrew spies that we let out of her window on a piece of red string. I do not recall from Sunday school any particular discussion about Rahab's profession, which in retrospect was a very significant omission, you know? And so often, this story has been overlooked or sanitized or moralized beyond recognition. It's the story of Rahab, a prostitute, living in the margins of Jericho society, whose courageous love saves lives and changes history. Now, when Jesus said, "Love your neighbor," he did not add conditions. What Jesus says in the Synoptic Gospels is, "Love your neighbor." And in the Gospels, Jesus is responding to a lawyer who asks him, "Which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus responds, literally quoting the law of Moses, the Torah, which says in Leviticus, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus expands on that a little and says, "You shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now let's look at what Jesus did not say. Jesus did not say, love your respectable neighbor. Jesus did not say, love your neighbor who lives within the bounds of polite society. He simply said, love your neighbor. And Rahab, yes, Rahab, the so-called prostitute, shows us how it's done. The spies who come to Rahab's house are enemies, foreigners, part of a military reconnaissance mission. And yet she offers them shelter. She is like the anti-Vichy French resistance in World War II. Anybody remember World War II? Not personally, anyhow. In World War II, the French resistance, they broke the law. And Rahab broke the law. Now, before anyone gets their knickers in a twist, that the pastor said it was okay to break the law, I'd like to offer a little context. Context is always important. And in doing so, I'd like to offer another World War II example. Suppose it's 1944. You're in the Netherlands, and you're hiding Jewish people in your attic. And the Gestapo comes to your door and says, are you hiding any Jews? Well, you are, in fact, hiding Jews. Are you going to lie? What you need to know is what is the question underneath the question. The real question the Gestapo were asking was, are you hiding any people that we have immorally and illegally declared to be enemies of the state so we can take them out and murder them? And to that real question, you may, with a good conscience, say, nope. And that's exactly what Rahab did. And in doing so, Rahab crossed every boundary: political, cultural, religious, moral. Loving our neighbor means being willing to transcend boundaries, even when it's messy or complicated or risky. In our world today, we are often told to fear our neighbors: immigrants, queer folks, Muslims, people who live in tents downtown. They're all our neighbors. And Rahab reminds us that love doesn't ask where you came from or whether you deserve help. Love acts, love protects, love risks. And Rahab herself lives on the edge, literally. Her house is built into the city wall. It's not prime real estate. She's part of the economy, but she is not respected by it. And her body is commodified, but her wisdom ignored. That phrase, her body is commodified, but her wisdom ignored. Hold on to that. Now, here's some things I learned this week when I was working on this sermon. Pretty much all of them go under the heading of things that for some strange reason they never taught me in seminary. And apparently there is some debate, even among sex workers, as to what one should call sex workers. In the Hebrew, in the story, calls Rahab a prostitute. I am told that among people in the oldest profession, the preferred term is sex workers. There is not, however, unanimity on this. Some folks actually prefer prostitute. One woman actually told me she kind of prefers hoe. All things considered, I'm going to go with sex worker, and that's what I put in the reading. And you know, I do not make these stories up, people. They're right there in the Bible. You know, the 2nd chapter of the book of Joshua, if you're interested. Anyhow, I learned a lot of new and interesting things this week that they never covered in seminary. But the thing is, I didn't learn these things from reading the Bible or consulting learned commentaries, of which I have lots and lots, big, thick books. I did consult them too, but you know what? I got the real information from people just like Rahab, whose bodies were commodified, but whose deep, raw wisdom about the world and about human nature is generally ignored. And believe me, it is profound wisdom. They've seen some stuff the rest of us seldom see. And their lived experience is real, and frankly, sometimes they have important things to tell us. And sometimes, like Rahab, important things to do, because God chooses her. You know, when Jesus carried out their ministry here on earth, they didn't gravitate to the rich and powerful. They gathered with the marginalized, the disrespected, the hated even ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. And you know what Jesus said about them? They said the tax collectors and prostitutes would enter the realm of God before the people who looked down on them. So God chose Rahab to do the work of love and justice, to show up and do the right thing. God works through Rahab. You know, every time I write a sermon, I ask myself, where's the good news? Where's the gospel? Because gospel means good news. And in this story of Rahab, I think there's good news for all of us who live or have lived at the margins, or who've ever felt outside the circle of religious respectability. Because in Rahab, we see that God's work doesn't wait for approval. It rises up in unexpected places, from sex workers, from refugees, from survivors, from total strangers. Now, Rahab lies to her own authority. She betrays her own city. This story is not easy or neat. But here's the truth. Sometimes loving your neighbor means civil disobedience. Sometimes loving your neighbor means breaking unjust systems. Sometimes loving your neighbor means telling the truth in a world that is built on lies. And Rahab's love of neighbor is not sentimental. It's courageous, it's costly, it's real love in action, and it's the justice that love looks like in public. And in a world of rising authoritarianism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and poverty that is both manufactured and legislated, loving our neighbor may look like taking a risk. It may look like it's going to cost us something. To welcome the refugee, to stand with the trans kid, to protect the unhoused, to shelter those fleeing violence, that is not just charity. That is solidarity. And that's the difference between being kind to the other and realizing that the other is actually one of us. That's what happens when you love your neighbor as yourself, because they are one of us. There is no other, just all of us doing our best and helping each other. And that's what Rahab teaches us. I did not learn this in Sunday school, but that's what Rahab teaches us, and that's that we're not just supposed to offer charity to our neighbor. I think when Jesus says that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, we are to be in true solidarity with them. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again probably quite a few times in the course of this sermon series on loving your neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographical term. Neighbor is a moral imperative. And the story of Rahab has import for us when we look at her legacy. And when we read the story to find ourselves and to find our own divine calling to love and justice. Now, you can read the rest of Rahab's story in the book of Joshua. Because of her courageous actions, Rahab survives the ensuing conquest of Jericho. But Rahab doesn't just survive. She shows up again in the New Testament. In the reading that I read from the Gospel according to Matthew, she is listed in the genealogy of Jesus. She's one of only 4 women named in that list of Jesus' ancestors. Her courage and compassion literally shaped the lineage of Christ. And her story reminds us that love in action has a ripple effect, far, far beyond what we can see. When we love our neighbor, especially the unexpected ones, we become, like Rahab, part of God's unfolding story of liberation. So today, let's ask not only, who is my neighbor, but perhaps more importantly, what kind of neighbor am I? Can we be neighbors like Rahab, bold and brave in the face of empire, fierce in our protection of the vulnerable, and faithful to the law of love? Jesus said, love your neighbor, and Rahab shows us how. Amen?
Amen.